We're going to begin by looking at Europe in the 14th century. Europe is emerging from the Dark Ages, and new technologies and innovations are beginning to appear. The new information and discoveries are causing an age of humanism, and regional and artistic styles are developing. Artisan guilds begin to form, and town rivalries start to emerge. For now, we are focusing on Italy, and the two main town rivalries that exist are between Florence and Siena. Emphasis on the individual is on the rise. So you just heard me mention a key term, humanism. In a broad sense, humanism simply means the rise of the individual. But there are some visual clues in art that are beginning to emerge that indicate the rise of the individual during the Proto-Renaissance. This is particularly evident in paintings that have religious figures in them. If we compare a medieval depiction of a figure with a proto-Renaissance depiction of a figure, we begin to see that artists are making figures seem more human-like and more relatable to the individual in society. So instead of the religious figures seeming otherworldly, seeming as if the religious person is not a living human being, now all of a sudden the religious person is going to look more human-like. In this work of art, humanism is seen in the way that the artist portrays Jesus. Stop and look at what the artist does to emphasize Jesus' human features. See if you can name at least 3 details that the artist has painted to show us that Jesus is a man and not just a heavenly figure. I hope you said that Jesus shows a lot of emotion on his face. The artist shows us this through the line work that he uses in Jesus's face, through the slant of the eyes and the downturn of the lips. Jesus looks as if he's in pain. Only humans exhibit that kind of emotion. You see it some on animals, but for the most part, emotion is something that we relate to as human beings here on Earth. You see the individual muscle structure of Jesus, whereas when we talked about figure 1 in the previous slide, there was no muscle structure shown at all. His body looks human, just like ours. We look in the mirror and can relate to this human body the way we relate to our own. In addition, you can see that the slant of the figure is a normal slant in which if the figure were hanging from, in this case, across, the body would be positioned at a slight angle. And so that slight angle helps us to relate to the position of the body as being human. Okay, so I promised you a rivalry. Siena is the city in which artists are beginning to implement humanistic ideas. It is governed by an oligarchy, and in the 14th century, we call that oligarchy the Nine. They're called the Siena Nine. They are a group of families who are merchants and business people within the community, and they're very powerful. They shape many of the decisions within the community. They only govern the city of Siena, and remember at this time, Italy was governed by city-states. So there is not one centralized government. Each city-state has its own rules and its own claims to fame. And those rules and claims to fame are determined by the oligarchy or the Siena Nine. The next 2 paintings that we're going to look at are called The Effects of Good Government. They're done by artist Ambrogio Lorenzetti, who is the main painter in Siena. The oligarchy, the nine, commission works from him that tend to be landscapes or cityscapes with allegorical meaning that are meant to be propaganda. Most of his works appear in public places. For example, these two works appear in the Palazzo Pubblico, and they show Siena as a prospering city and a prospering rural area. Unfortunately, Siena doesn't stay prosperous, as there is a flood that happens that wipes out a good portion of the natural landscape. There's a financial banking crisis, and then the bubonic plague wipes out most of the people within the next decade. Siena does eventually rebuild, but it takes some time. This next slide shows a detail of the cityscape that Lorenzetti painted in the Palazzo Pubblico. It is just a detail from the slide that we saw previously. We're honing in on the cityscape right now. You can see in the lower right-hand corner there is a wall that's being built. The wall and the city itself are called a citadel. In medieval times, often there was a wall built around the city for protection, and it helps to define where the city is versus where the rural town is. And if you look in the lower front of the painting, you'll see the human beings. They're painted in large scale compared to the buildings. This phenomenon is called hierarchy of scale. It's just basically a way that the artist is telling you that the humans are important, and he wants you to see that the humans are more important than the landscape behind them. One of the reasons he would have painted this way is because the oligarchy has been painted in the front. The oligarchy is the patron of the painting, or the person who commissioned the painting. And because of that, as a thank you to the oligarchy, Lorenzetti is painting them as being important. You can see a dance troupe in one of the buildings practicing. This is Lorenzetti's way of attributing culture into the city. But you can also see that the buildings are in good repair. That's just Lorenzetti's way of saying, hey, the city is prospering. Obviously, if he would have painted the buildings in a non-idealized way, we would see that the city wasn't as prosperous. So the buildings being idealized, the human beings being larger, the presence of the dance troupe make the city seem like an idealized place to be. This is a detail from the rural side of the effects of good government. We are looking at a figure that sits in the upper left-hand corner of the fresco, and she is considered the personification of justice. I mentioned that Lorenzetti painted an allegory. An allegory can be an entire work of art, or it could just be an element in the work of art. It is an image that symbolizes an idea, concept, or principle that is often religious or moral in nature. In this case, Lorenzetti paints an allegory, or a symbol, of what good government should be. This piece is considered propaganda for the nine who commissioned the work of art. On one hand, you can see the woman holding the city's gallows, where people would be hung for their crimes. On the other hand, she holds a scroll that states that it is safe to enter the city because she has purged unjusticeness from the city. Here you can see the oligarchy headed into the city, or into the rural side from the city, to visit the rural tenants. You can see evidence of the old feudal system being used. In the upper left-hand corner, you can see the serfs working the land. In the right-hand corners, you can see productive land having been harvested throughout the year. Lorenzetti chooses to paint the land in all of the seasons. So the winter season is in the upper left, the fall season is in the forefront of the painting, and in the middle of the painting, you can see the harvest time. You can also see that the hierarchy are of scale here, with the oligarchy being larger than any of the other people in the rural side. One of the things that we find in the different art historical eras that we talk about in art history is that the movement itself is not just about art. It's not typically about one set of philosophies that only applies to art. Movements like humanism come from a larger source of people within society, meaning that it's not just the artist. Oftentimes it's the philosopher, and there are medical advancements, and there are literary advancements that all work together to create a movement. In this case, what I'm showing you all works together is literary arts and visual arts and philosophy. Those all work together to create this concept of humanism. Does it define the Proto-Renaissance in the art historical era? I would say that the Proto-Renaissance is a supporting era to the ideas of humanism. It's a very important movement in the historical world of art because it's that movement right before the great Renaissance masters that sort of blow humanism out of the water and they create a humanistic society that we live in today. And so this small stepping stone becomes an important projection for the world we live in today. And I would say that's why we focus on it heavily in art history, because it's that moment that is right before all those great Renaissance masters that we look to sort of define humanism in our world. That group of people that begin the Proto-Renaissance, or that begin humanistic ideas, start in the late Gothic. But the Proto-Renaissance masters tend to propel it. The artists that I'm showing you in this slide are not visual artists. They're literary artists. During this time, we have a group of writers that become very important in terms of propelling those humanistic ideas. Petrarch is one of them. He was a poet. He was very influential and pioneers the creative beginnings of the Proto-Renaissance movement. Other literary superstars that we see during this time are Dante. He wrote the Inferno. Chaucer, who wrote the Canterbury Tales, and Christine de Pizan. Going back to the ideas of humanism, humanism is literally the emphasis on the individual. The individual becomes the very important part of European society during this era, and it's really the linchpin of change in terms of how it affects all of the Western world today. It's this concept of me versus we. It's this concept of I think, therefore I am. It's a concept of becoming more focused on the individual of society. Now I want to backtrack just a minute because we talked a few slides ago about feudalistic society and the effects of good government. Typically, I ask my students, what is feudalism? And they basically tell me that they don't really know how to explain it, but they know what it is. Feudalism is that system within society. It's a class social system, and it's a system in which all of society lives by during the late Gothic era. It's a society in which they collectively work the land together to create a miniature economy and a miniature working society within the town. And so it's a more collected idea of society, it's a more communal idea of society. When the Proto Renaissance comes along, all of a sudden that individual in society becomes more important. We begin to focus more on that idea and concept of who am I and how do I fit into the world around me, regardless of what society says about me. These ideas of I think, therefore I am come into play more and more as we get closer and closer to the contemporary time period. Does that mean that feudal society is not as sophisticated as the Western society's ideal system of humanism? The answer to that question is no. Each society runs in its own way. Each society has its own sophistications. Each society has its own system of achievement. So if you look at our world today, you couldn't say that the Western world is more accomplished than, say, the Asian world or the African world or the Eastern world. Sometimes they're just a different way of life or a different way of looking at community as a whole. Sometimes they are systems of society that work better than our individualistic society that we focus on in the West. Okay, so I went down the rabbit hole of humanism. Let's shift back to art. But first, before we shift back to art, I want to talk to you about architecture in Italy as a whole. If you've ever been to Europe, you will know that the streets are gridded in an axial plan, as opposed to streets in the West typically have a 90-degree organizational system. In fact, like if you look on a map, everything's gridded off in boxes, right? Whereas in Europe, everything sort of stems from this main hub. So there's like a central circle and then like spokes on a wheel. Things jet out within the city from that main hub. That main hub is typically the town square. We call that a palazzo in Italy. And each town square typically has a town building that is an important center. We just got done looking at the effects of good government. It is in a palazzo pubblico, meaning it's in the public palazza of Siena. Florence has one of those palazzas as well, and it's a very important place in which art is displayed. It's an important place where people go for whatever civic needs they have. Oftentimes, if you have a birth or a marriage or something like that, you need to file government documents. Those things are done at the civic center. So just wanted to give you that background information about the way that European streets tend to be organized. This is the Piazza della Signoria. It is the piazza for Florence. So we've moved to Florence. We just got done talking about Siena and art in Siena. Let's talk about art in Florence. Just like Siena, Florence has a ruling body. They're called the Signoria. That ruling body is their oligarchy. This is the town hall where the body met and where democracy of the ruling elite takes place. Rules, civic engagements happen here at the Palazzo della Signoria. Next to the town hall, you see a loggia. A loggia is a covered walkway. It provides shade and protection from the elements of the sun and inclement weather to people who were gathering at the piazza. Because the piazza is a civic building, oftentimes there were large crowds that were drawn to the civic building, and so the loggia was necessary because an overabundance of people would be there. Today, the loggia actually houses artwork. Typically, it will house sculpture, but back in the Proto-Renaissance times, it would have just provided shade for people who were coming to the civic area. These are the Baptist doors of, these are the baptistry doors of the Cathedral of San Giovanni in Florence. They were done by an artist named Pisano. He was awarded the commission for the baptistry doors in 1330. They have 20 scenes of the life of John the Baptist, who the Church of San Giovanni is dedicated to. The doors have an overall effect of flatness, mostly due to the repeated shape of the quatrefoil. The use of gold is prominent in the figures, and each panel makes a shape called the quatrefoil that's housed in a rectangular background. The figures tend to feel as if they float within that quatrefoil. I think mostly because the grid creates a sense of depth. Here's a detail of one of the panels from the baptistry doors of San Giovanni. And you can see how the quatrefoil shape, that's this four-leaf clover shape behind the figures, sort of frames the figures in, but creates a sense of depth. The quatrefoil shape feels as if it recedes into space from the framing of the box or the grid that Pisano creates to house the quatrefoil shape. And then the scene tends to float out in front of it, I think because it projects upward from the quatrefoil shape. And so you get this interesting sense of depth. But then when he adds the gold leafing onto the figures feel like they sort of float out towards you. They are elongated. They have great sense of movement. The humanism comes in from the idea that Jesus is being baptized. That's something that's done here on earth during his life, as a human. And then you see John the Baptist baptizing Jesus. John the Baptist is tipped over at the hips, sort of leaning towards Jesus with a pail of water. You can see the garment flows towards the right, and he has a sense of elongation, but a more humanistic look than the Gothic figures. The gold leafing, the quatrefoil shape are both hallmarks of the Proto-Renaissance era. So Giotto is the next artistic superstar when we talk about Florence. He was a student of Cimabue's, and he apprenticed with Cimabue in the latter half of Cimabue's career. He really surpasses his teacher's representation of the humanistic form. He accomplishes this by drawing from live models, which really hadn't been done for a couple centuries at this point. He also works among the Franciscan monks. They believed in a simple, humble life that emphasized more of a direct experience with God. And so that direct experience with God is more relatable if God is a human and here on earth. Art historians believe that the life of the Franciscans really influenced Giotto's style, and the way that Giotto emphasized humanism even more than Cimabue. So I ask you, how does Giotto influence, or how does Giotto represent the humanistic form? I hope that the first thing you said was by using hierarchy of scale. You can see here that the Madonna takes up most of, at least 50% of the icon. She's very large. If she stood up, she would be massive compared to the size of the human beings that sit at her right and sit at her left. He represents her in this structure. The architectural structure that she sits in, the throne, is much more angular than the one that we saw of Cimabue's. That angle helps us to understand perspective, and it's a much more convincing recession of space. Additionally, he uses naturalism. Naturalism is a more realistic looking human attribute. Here, it's in the faces. You can see the detail of the face is much more naturalistic looking. It looks like a real person's face, even though it's the face of an angel. Naturalism is sort of a new technique in terms of artistic representation, because prior to this they had been using a more streamlined representation of the face, meaning that the individualism that you see in the face of the angel isn't the same as what you see in the Gothic sculptures. This person's face looks the way it really is in real life, whereas in the sculptures that we see from the Gothic era, they're less individualized. You can't tell them apart quite as readily as you would Giotto's figure. In addition to, Giotto's figure looks like someone that you could pick out on the street. That person really exists in real life. The sculptures that we look at from the Gothic era don't look as if that person is someone that you could pick out of a crowd. We see even more readily how Giotto creates a more humanistic form when you compare Cimabue's work directly with Giotto's. So when we compare the two pieces, we see that while they both use hierarchy of scale and they both have very similar subject matter, that is the Mother Mary sitting with Jesus on her lap, the architectural space that Cimabue surrounds Mary with is very different than the one that surrounds Giotto's Mary. It is because of the architectural surrounding that we understand the space more so in Giotto's icon. Additionally, if you look at where the angels stand, the angels in Giotto's work look directly at Mary. In Cimabue's work, the angels look out at you, the viewer, which makes the work of art feel less humanistic. Why? Because when something important is happening in front of you, most everybody is directing their attention towards the thing that's most important. If all of a sudden some heavenly being came down and dropped in your middle of your living room, you would likely be looking at the heavenly being and not at the person who's coming to your front door. In addition to the donor portraits are the two angels that sit at the right, or that kneel at the right and left of Mary's throne. Those angels also look directly at Mary, whereas the donor portraits in Cimabue's work look directly out at you, the viewer. Cimabue's work recedes into space, and we can tell so by the way that he utilizes the ellipses in the composition, the way he repeats the shape of the tread of the stair receding into space, whereas Giotto's tread of the stair seems to really recede into space through this idea of the ledge. In Giotto's composition, we don't see as much of the cushion that Mary sits on. Why? Because Mary is so very large that the cushion that she's sitting on sort of is tucked under the entire weight of her body, whereas in Cimabue's we see a lot more of the cushion, and it makes Mary feel less weighty. That less weighty feeling has a sense of otherworldliness to it. While Giotto's career begins in Florence, he was soon known throughout Italy. His Florence commission wins him a commission in Padua and a commission in Rome. The commission that he was awarded in Padua was for a powerful family who was part of an oligarchy named the Scrivingis. The chapel was restitution for the family's usury. Because the commission of works of art in the chapel, because of the commission of the works of art in the chapel, the Pope pardons the Scrivingis from the charge of usury in 1303. The chapel was there to remind the family of their sins and to help them follow a more pious path of living. At the time, usury was punished by death. So before we talk about the Arena Chapel, let's figure out what a few things mean. There are two types of fresco painting. One is called buon fresco, which is true fresco. This is the type of fresco painting that was used by Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel. It is when an artist uses a powdered pigment and mixes it into the plaster that's going to be used to create the wall. It's the pigments applied to the wet plaster. And so as the wall dries, the painting becomes literally part of the wall. To see how this is done, you can copy and paste this YouTube link that I've included for you. The other type of fresco painting is called secco fresco, and it's painting that's done on top of the plaster wall. The plaster wall has already cured, and it isn't part of the wall itself. This, type of fresco painting, buon fresco, is looked at as being a more artistic way to paint fresco. It's also looked at as being harder skill to master than secco fresco. Another term we're going to talk about is grisaille. Grisaille are these gray-looking. Here's an exterior shot of the Arena Chapel in Padua, also known as the Scrivingis Chapel. Enrico Scrivingi was the son of the father and son banking business team that was accused of usury. He was also the person responsible for commissioning the chapel's art. And so you see him pictured here as the donor, just like we've seen in other paintings that represent the donor in the work of art. Here's a shot of the Arena Chapel standing at the entrance. You can see the paintings that are on the walls from the right and the left side. They are done in the chapel. The chapel itself is a large barrel vault. And there are places to kneel for prayer. Here you can see a little bit more close-up of the paintings on the left side of the chapel wall, as well as you get a better idea of where those gracile figures were in the chapel. They were in the lowest register. They would have been parallel to the person who was in the chapel kneeling in front of the altar. These chapels were private chapels. They were chapels that were solely for the purpose of the family to go sit and pray. They're public chapels now, but then they would have been a place to sit and pray and contemplate good and bad deeds. Here you see a detail of one of the wall panels that was painted by Giotto. We will concentrate on the painting in the lower left corner of the section. This painting in the lower left corner is called The Lamentation. It depicts Jesus' followers at the time that he was taken from the cross before he was laid to rest in the tomb. The innovative thing that Giotto has done in this painting has to do with the balance and distribution of the figures. So let's look at the next slide closely. See if you feel that the composition is balanced, and think about why or why not you feel that the composition is balanced. So this is Giotto's The Lamentation from the Arena Chapel. It's that fresco that I told you we were going to hone in on. One of the things I wanted to share with you in terms of definitions is modeling. Modeling is the way in which the artist creates a volume to the figure. So you can see that the dark shadows are placed on the figure to the right, and that the light comes from the upper left-hand corner of the image. As the light shines on, let's say, the back of the figure that is in green closest to the picture plane, you can see that the light creates a highlight on the back as well as that shadow. That's how we determine how an object recedes into space. If there's no light source and the shadow isn't clear, you don't know where the light hits the human, and you also don't know where the weight within the object is. We'll see many examples of this, so you'll get more and more used to picking that out. This is Giotto's Lamentation, and the major innovation that we see here in Giotto's Lamentation has to do with the way in which he distributes space in the Lamentation. You see the diagonal rock that cuts through the picture plane? It sort of bisects it from one section to the other. And instead of bisecting it in half or horizontally, it does it diagonally. This is an illustration technique that Giotto is using to draw attention to the main thing that's happening here, which is the grieving over Jesus's body before he's laid to rest in the tomb. You can see through the gestures of the people that this is a very dramatic scene. For example, the woman who's bended over, I guess it's a male figure, I'm sorry, who's bended over looking at Jesus with her hands behind her, in this grand gesture that imitates the way in which the rock runs through the composition. You have a woman at Jesus's feet looking at the holes from the cross. You have Mary holding Jesus, grieving over his body. There's a woman standing above Jesus's head, looking at the scene, and a woman to her right, gesturing in prayer with her hand underneath her cheek, sort of beside herself in grief. Above this scene, you see this big space of blue, Within that big space of blue, there are lots of little cherubs flying above the scene. Those cherubs represent the heavenly world coming down to witness the death of Jesus. There's another thing that we have in this composition. It's called a giornata. The giornata is the line that's created when the artist lays the plaster in the painting on the wall. Most of the time, the artist uses that line to create an edge, for example, where the clothing meets the edge of the rock would be a giornata. But in the case of backgrounds, sometimes it's difficult to get the exact same color when you are mixing the plaster and the pigment. If you've ever painted before, you really do know that this is true. You mix a color, and you're never going to get that exact same color again. And so plaster dries fairly quickly. And in order to get it on the wall and get the section of the wall accomplished, you have to apply it fairly rapidly, which means you don't want to mix a really big batch of blue plaster up because it'll dry before you get it all on the wall. So placing the patch of plaster on the wall usually represents an entire day's worth of work in fresco painting. The giornata is created when the next day happens, you come in and lay another section of plaster. I am going to point out in the next slide the giornata. This is another one of the panels in the Scrivingi Chapel. It's called The Kiss of Death, or The Kiss of Judah, by Giotto. It's one of the most moving panels that Giotto paints within the chapel. It was a scene in which Judas betrayed Jesus. The scene was no doubt intended to remind the Scrivingi family of their usury sin. You see Judas, he's identifying Jesus by kissing him on the cheek. The angry mob surrounds him. They raise their clubs to him, but they also carry torches to illuminate the scene. Not only do they carry torches, Giotto makes them very angular. He creates drama by using these diagonal lines that point you to the center important part of the scene, which is Judas giving Jesus a kiss, giving Jesus up as, or identifying Jesus to the Roman officials. We see the Roman soldiers wearing typical Roman soldier garb. It is shorter in length than the ones that Jesus and the Christian people wear. You can also see the dramatic modeling that Giotto develops within the composition. So what we saw prior to this, we saw modeling, but the great depth that Giotto gets comes from this illuminated light source. The illuminated light source is a bit like the candle illuminating a dark room. And so you get this more dramatic effect of highlighting and darkness within the composition. Also, he places Jesus in the center of the composition and Judas in the center of the composition. This placement draws the eye directly to Judas giving up Jesus. That act becomes very dramatic and the most important information within the scene because he places it in the middle. The angry mob very much looks like a mob would here on Earth. You can only see the tops of people's heads, and you can see the shadows on the ground that the light creates by using the torchlight. There is a rhetorical question here to the side. Can you spot anything else that makes the scene feel so very powerful? Okay, so let's go back to our Siena-Florentine rivalry. To give you a better idea of how art in Siena rivals art in Florence, the best thing I can do is compare it to OSU football. It it was sort of like Michigan and OSU. The city's main source of pride comes from their art. Like the Florentine painters, the Sienese painters were also caught up in imitating these wonky, elongated figures from the Gothic era. Sienese painters, though, put more emphasis on the decorative elements in the painting, and Duccio was the Sienese all-star of the 14th century. Here you can see Duccio's Virgin and Child icon. The heavy emphasis is on the painting, or the heaviest emphasis in the painting is on the patterning of the fabric that's being held up by the angels and the patterning of the throne that Mary sits on. Even the frame that surrounds the icon has a beautiful patterning in between the in between the portrait and the frame, as well as you get this decorative shell-like feature that is at the back of the throne. The emphasis that Giotto places on humanistic traits of the angels were not quite as pronounced in the Sienese paintings. You can see that the angels have human traits, and they're somewhat individualized, more so than, say, Cimabue's, but definitely not as individualized as Giotto's. Nor does Bonensagna elongate the figures the way Cimabue does, and he doesn't place them in a more natural position of being kneeling on the floor. They do stack, and so it seems that the ones that are closest to us, the ones at the bottom, are a little bit closer to us than the ones at the top, but they really don't have a spatial reference within the composition. He does make some attempt at communicating perspective. He shows us lines that recede into space, mostly on the throne that the Madonna sits on. So this is Bonensagna's Maestal altarpiece. It was made for the Sienese Cathedral in 1308. It's a large altarpiece. It was commissioned by the cathedral and is made from many wood panels that were put together. It has a front and a back so that the viewer can walk completely around the altarpiece, and the lower section of the altarpiece is called the predella. It was used to give the person who was kneeling at the icon something to focus on while praying. Duccio signed this work of art where Mary's feet rest at the base of the throne. The signature runs around the platform that she rests her feet on. The work is massive. It's 15 by 20 feet, and it depicts Mary as the queen of the heavenly court. The next group of artists that we're going to look at are artists that looked at Duccio's work in their studio and in their youth. And the work of art made tremendous impression on the Lorenzetti brothers. Here you can see a close-up of the Maestral altarpiece. You can see that this scene in which Mary sits in the center, Mary is the largest in scale. But unlike Giotto's work, she doesn't look unhuman by being so large. She sits on a throne, but you can tell that the throne is weighted at the same level that all the people stand on. The crowd that surrounds her looks at her, but they also look at other people within the crowd, which is typical of the way we as humans view the world, right? We look at each other. Sometimes when something major is going on, we mostly are looking at the thing in the middle, but sometimes we look away or look at somebody else within the crowd. You can see a close-up of the scenes of the predella here. There's a nativity scene. There's a flight into Egypt scene. The back of the altarpiece has small scenes that were painted individually and then put together to create one large painting. You can also see that the predella scenes go all the way around the altarpiece so that the viewer in the back and the front have something to focus on while praying. Here's a close-up of the scenes from the back. I know it's a little bit blurry. It's hard to get a close-up of the individual scenes, but one of the main central scene is Jesus on the cross. You can see at the bottom different scenes that depict the biblical stories. They are scenes that take place here on Earth. They all have a humanistic element to them. The people all are very much images that are humanistic and the forefront of thought in the world of the Proto-Renaissance world and the new idea set that religion is for people who are here on Earth. Therefore, we should make our religious figures here on Earth as well. Okay, so before we move on, I want to go back to the Lorenzetti brothers because the Lorenzetti brothers were heavily influenced by Duccio. They painted in Siena, and they were definitely artists that were highly influential in perpetuating the humanistic style. They painted the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena. The Palazzo Pubblico is pictured here. It is the public building in which all civic things take place. So here we see an inside view of the Palazzo. We can see the most detailed account that we have of life in a medieval community. Ambrosio chronicles the myriad of activities that allow a community to prosper in the effects of good government. We can see them bringing in goods from the country, raw materials for industry, and lots of various merchants who sell their wares because of their knowledge of a skilled trade. Here you can see the fresco a little bit better. The portrayal of life in the countryside is on the right and the city is on the left. The presentation of both countryscape and cityscape illustrates the annual cycle of activity between the city and the country. Here, life in the countryside, immediately outside of the city, shows the sowing of seeds for crops that will be sold in the market at harvest time. Aristocrats go out from the city to hunt, and farmers bring in their livestock and goods to the city for sale. Ambrosio's portrayal of the countryside is revolutionary in the history of art because it's the first landscape that was based on a specific geographical location. If you look at the next slide, you will see that Ambrosio has depicted the annual topography of the city of Siena. Oh, I'm sorry. He's depicted the actual topography of the city of Siena. Additionally, this is a rare work of art because it depicts a complete secular subject. Here you can see the city in which Ambrosio is basing the city off of. It is the city of Siena. This was a really important work. The separation of church and state doesn't happen for a really long time. But the fact that this is a civic work highlights that art for the public can be different than art for private patronage. It highlights the strides that the medieval community was making towards the Renaissance. And it highlights how the Renaissance came about, meaning that the city was getting strong, and we're seeing the precursor of its strength right here. Another work of art that Lorenzetti does is The Birth of the Virgin. It is a triptych and an altarpiece. And it was commissioned for the Siena Cathedral. It was completed in 1343 by Pietro Lorenzetti. It's a tempera on panel painting that celebrates the Virgin, who is the patron saint of Siena. Lorenzetti is known for this painting because it is a genre scene. A genre scene is a painting that represents a theme of something that happens at home. And so The Birth of the Virgin is a scene of everyday life in the household, right? It's a scene of a woman giving birth. Excuse me. It's a scene of the woman giving birth and of the father sitting outside of the bedchamber waiting for the baby to be born. Mary's mother lays in a bed. It's represented with this checkerboard pattern, which helps to communicate space recession. So as the vertical and horizontal lines that we call orthogonals recede into space, they change in terms of width. And so you get this idea that the painting recedes into space. It makes the Virgin Mary more human. She was born into this world just like anybody else. You can see the midwives who are standing at the end of the Virgin Mary's bed. The figures are very modeled. They are solid looking. Definitely a influence from Duccio's work. And the framing of the work of art helps to create a sense of depth within the painting. We, as the viewer, peer into a scene that is private. Well, not everyone is in love with the new humanism that is dominating the avant-garde in art during the Proto-Renaissance time. The people who don't like the new humanistic art are the people of the court. They recognize that humanism is a rise of the individual. They also recognize that if at some point the individuals realize that they outnumber the clergy and the royal court is no longer going to be able to keep power within the region. And so you get artists like Simone Martini and Lippo Memmi, who create works of art that are more catered to the royal patrons. This style is called the International Gothic style, and it looks different than the Proto-Renaissance style. It doesn't have an earthly setting. It's usually gilded completely in gold. You can see that the background is solid gold. It also usually has a very ornate sense of framing, like this work of art does. It has an emphasis on elongation. And you can see that the figures feel otherworldly. They don't feel human-like. the other works of art that we've looked at. The gold is a color in which the figures are built on. They are not, they don't have any natural background to them. They don't have as much weight. You can see that Mary pulls at her clothing. It's an elegant gesture that symbolizes nobility. Cathedrals at the time were very similar to the Gothic cathedrals that we saw in the late Gothic. The main difference is the facade is flat. It's designed by I'm sorry, I don't pronounce that Italian name very well. Maitini. It is the Orvieto Cathedral in Orvieto, Italy. And it's a cathedral that is more reminiscent of the Renaissance times. The facade is flat, but it still has an emphasis on elongation like we saw in the Gothic styles. The original design of the cathedral was Romanesque, and you can see that behind the facade. The facade was redesigned by Mattani, and he tries to hide the chunky style that the Romanesque building has, and he does that with emphasis on elongation and the thinness of the front of the facade of the building. Well, what happens to our avant-garde pioneers of humanism and Renaissance style? The plague happens. All of a sudden, the Lorenzetti brothers completely disappear from the artistic record altogether. And we don't really know what happened to them. After the plague, art in Tuscany tends to revert back to themes of judgment and punishment, and it moves away from scenes of humanism. This is an image of Saint Sebastian. He becomes a very popular image in the history of art at this time because he is is a saint of healing. A writer from Siena wrote this about the plague: the largest, most mysterious, and most horrible disease you could imagine takes hold. People die almost immediately. There are swellings on the groin and the armpit. The disease spread so quickly that people thought that it was transmitted through gaze or breath. And truly, so many people died in the months of May, June, July, and August that no one could be called to bury them for any amount of money. And I, Agnolo de Tura, call the fat, buried my 5 children in a pit with my own hands, as did many others. So you can see that the plague was a grave time, and the innovations of the Proto-Renaissance come to a screeching halt at the end of the 13th century.